I think trauma in childhood is one of those things where if you went through it, you know that you had trauma in childhood. You don't really need too much of a definition. There's one way to describe it, which is what happened to you. So that could be abuse, neglect, living in a chaotic, disruptive, dysfunctional household, living in a community where there's a lot of violence, being a refugee, for example, that can be a traumatic situation. But there's another way to describe it, and that is to talk about how it feels. So first of all, one of the things that you might feel is that it's difficult to trust. The people that you should have been able to trust were not trustworthy and didn't care for you, didn't care for you in the way that you should have been cared for as a child. The next thing to think about is a feeling of safety, that if you grew up in a traumatic situation, your sense of safety gets broken because you were not protected or cared for in the way that you should have been. You can carry around scars emotionally and physically, of course, for the things that happened to you and not have that had the opportunity to heal from that, didn't have the care that you needed to heal from that moment, or you didn't have the proper steps given to you or provided to heal from those things. The next thing that happens is a disruption of your normal development process. When you experience trauma, your brain can get stuck in a fear state. So your fear center, which is the part of your brain called the amygdala, can actually become more sensitive, and that's a protective measurement. That's something you do to protect yourself because you don't want to have that experience again. So your brain will adjust itself to say, let's keep looking for fearful situations. So if you're someone who grew up and experience anxiety, for example, and say, I don't really understand where this anxiety is coming from. Well, it can come from the fact that your brain is just more sensitive to anything that might lead to a dangerous situation. Nothing I say here should be interpreted as that's the way you are and you are always going to be that way. The reason we teach these things is because once you become aware of them, you get to know yourself, that's when you can start making massive changes in how you see yourself, and you can retrain your brain. Your brain is something called we call the brain has plasticity, which means that it can change. And as you go through life, your brain is going to change and you can retrain yourself. Then the final thing about trauma in childhood is that you carry an extra layer of burdens with you throughout your life because you had that trauma, because you have to work hard to overcome some of those feelings of fear. You don't have the healing that you might have needed. Your brain is developed differently, and you don't have the trust that other people might have in the world in general and in other people. So trauma is a profound experience to have in childhood. It will affect you for the rest of your life. But, and this is the whole point of bounce back generation, is that it doesn't have to. And the great thing about our brain is that our brain continues to develop all through our lives. And there's a lot that we have power over in terms of how we can retrain our brain. And part of doing that is retraining our body, because as the famous book, The Body Keeps a Score, and if you're interested in learning more about trauma, I would highly recommend that book. The Body Keeps a Score by Bessel van der Kolk is about how we not only feel trauma in our brain and how our brain develops, but we feel it in our body. We contain trauma in our body in aches and pains and how we react to things and our nervous system reaction to things, and our feelings of PTSD, where our body thinks that it's in a traumatic situation, even though it's something that happened in the past. That's essentially what PTSD is. If you break it down, it's that your brain doesn't contain the memories in the proper places or in the proper way. So you feel like you're in that trauma in that moment. You are not living in the present moment. And then the final thing that I think is really important is that trauma also gets contained in terms of how we look at the world and our spirit. And we think that the world is a terrible place because of the things that have happened in the past. When you experience trauma in childhood, your brain and body will develop differently in order to keep you safe. So you have this innate survival mechanism. So the first thing it will do is your brain will develop to become more hypersensitive and looking out for you for things that could be harmful to you. So it's becoming more hypervigilant. Now, hypervigilance also means you're more prone to getting anxiety. So if you're someone who suffers from anxiety and you had trauma in your childhood, just know that that's your brain trying to keep you safe. Now, once you know that, you can retrain your brain through lots of mechanisms, through therapy, cognitive behavior therapy. That's something that I used a lot to try to understand my own trauma and anxiety that would come up, which felt very unrelated to the moment. So I would be afraid of something, like, for example, I would be afraid sometimes to eat food that other people served me. I would feel really nervous that they had put drugs or poison in the food, things like that, mostly drugs. And that's based on something that happened to me when I was younger, where I was taken advantage of based on what somebody, you know, gave to me to ingest, right? So, and I'm sorry if that's triggering for anyone, but we want to talk about these things so that we can resolve them and we can get healthy. The next thing is your prefrontal cortex. Now, prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain that can plan things out and set goals and be really like, this is who I am and this is the things I'm going to do in life. If that gets dysregulated, it can be a problem in terms of how you control your impulses, whether you're able to plan ahead, how you think of things like steps and goals. The next thing that gets affected by trauma is your sense of security with other people. And that's something called attachment or insecure attachment. So insecure attachment is where you don't feel completely connected to your caregiver when you were growing up. So as you get older, you might be like super close to somebody and then pull away, or you might be unsure about whether someone likes you or not, and not really be able to have a sense of reality or how to judge reality when you're in relationship with other people. What are they thinking? How do they feel about me? Again, these are things that happen, but it doesn't mean that that's where you're stuck. You can learn how to develop those parts of yourself. And again, that'll be in another video. But the next thing that happens is something a little bit we talked about a little bit more about in the hypervigilance area, is that your limbic system, which is the system that is related to the amygdala, which is your fear center of your brain, that can become overactive. And so you're going to have maybe bigger emotions, you're going to overreact to things, or you're going to underreact and maybe shut down. And a lot of that can be covered also in thinking about how your nervous system reacts to things. And we have a booklet that I really recommend you download. It's completely free. It's on our website, bbgtv.org, which is called, I hope I get the name right, You and Stress and Owner's Manual. And it talks about those automatic reactions that we have to things, the fight, flight, faint, freeze, or fawn responses. And those are automatic responses that our nervous system kicks out of us when we are in certain situations. And they are personal in terms of what your nervous system is going to react to. I tend to get into the fight stage really fast, and I will go after somebody and I will defend myself. Other people run away from things. Sometimes people just pass out, they go to sleep. They freeze up, they don't know what to say, and then they feel really bad because they didn't know how to react in a situation. And then there's the fawn response, which is where you try to people please in the hopes that someone is not going to come after you and do something to you. All of those, again, once you become aware of them, you can start readjusting them. I don't go off on people and go nuts on them and beat the shit out of them or whatever because of my fight response. I've learned that's something that comes up. I can feel it coming up, and then I calm myself down because I'm aware. Next thing is something we talked a little bit about, and that's the theory of mind, and that's that ability to see yourself through other people. So people with trauma, because that part of your brain can become overstimulated when you're little because you're trying to protect yourself. And so you're always trying to suss out, what is this person thinking? What are they going to do to me? And so rather than interpret people's reactions to you in positive ways, you might misinterpret the cues to negative ways. So let's say that you walk up to someone and you say, here's a piece of cake. Do you want this piece of cake? And they say, you know what? I'm not having cake right now. So I'm going to decline that cake. And one person who has a stronger sense of self or theory of mind, as they call it, but a strong sense of self would say, oh, they're not going to have a cake today. That's okay. And another person might take it as a personal affront. Early childhood trauma, and this may seem pretty obvious, but sometimes people forget, will make you more susceptible to depression and isolation. And that makes a lot of sense when the world around you, when you were little, was unpredictable and unkind or scary or cruel, then you're going to tend to see all of the interactions that happen from that lens. I like to think of you put on your trauma glasses and now you see the world in a way that feels really negative and mean and cruel. And that can lead you to feeling depressed, of course, because what the hell kind of world we live in. And I'm someone who will support you in saying that this world is not always a kind and good place to live. But the isolation and depression, of course, feeds on itself. So be aware that you're going to do that and be aware that that is not the full picture. That is a picture, that is the glasses that you have that you can put on because of the things that happen to you. And you can take those glasses off, especially if as you get older and you're more in control of your life and you can start to look at the world in a different way, in a non traumatized person way. And that takes work. And that's going to be something that you're going to be dealing with for your life, but it's part of being a loving person to yourself. Love yourself enough to recognize trauma, get to know how it might be affecting you, and then doing the work that it's going to take to unravel that trauma so that you can see the world and yourself in the way that you should, which is the world is good, full of good and bad, and you're full of, positive and negative things, but you get to decide what you want to focus on and not live a life of, the aftermath of trauma, but to use trauma as the starting point for who you are, for how you're going to develop the life that you are. And that's why we talk a lot about having a sense of a hero's journey, that you start out with trauma. That can be your origin story, but that is not where you end up. The trauma from an origin story of any great hero is the place where they learn what are their values and what are the things that they want to change about the world. So next time you idolize any kind of hero, look at their origin story, and you're almost invariably going to find that the hero uses their trauma as in their origin story to develop their superpower. I'm going to be out there fighting for peace because I didn't have peace when I was in my origin story. I'm going to fight to protect children because nobody protected me. I'm going to fight to make sure that there's enough food for people because I went hungry. You have a whole world and a whole life to live outside of your trauma, and using your trauma to bounce back or bounce forward or bounce out of what happened to you. And this is the generation that's going to do that because we have to, because it's who we are. And we're at a point in our existence where we understand our brain and our body and what happens to us in trauma. This is a new thing as human beings that we are understanding. And so let's do it.